I'm so pleased that we're able to sit down and talk. I'm just such a fan of yours, and
Likewise.
both what you're doing in the theater and also the way that your theater, your art informs your activism, and the leadership roles that you take in our community. So I was sort of thinking, we'll get to Half-Life, but I also want to take this opportunity to sort of introduce you and some of the work that you do to some of the Tarragon audience who may be less familiar with the work. Um, do you want to tell me a bit about yourself and maybe how you came to the theater?
I live here in Toronto. I have lived kind of all across the country over, the first decade of my career. I studied in Montreal and in Edmonton. And I came to the theater like many of us do, not all of us certainly, but in that I just grew up doing it. It always felt available and accessible in a way that maybe other art forms don't always. I was able to be introduced to it in community spaces and at school. And I remember, when I was sort of at like a crossroads, thinking about, going to university and studying and having this kind of perhaps over, in my teenage mind, kind of like, I really thought that, the choices I made then would impact my life. And we know now with the hindsight of adulthood that that's not true. But I remember being like, I can't study theater. It's not, I need to do something that will better the world. Kind of, I felt these self-imposed pressure. And then I remember I was in a conversation with some theater grown-ups at a high school drama festival at this year's drama festival. They're like, why do you want to study theater? And I was like, oh, I do, but I can't. I have to do something more productive with my time, and then someone in the panel was like, well, there's ways you can use theater for social change. And I was like, what? And realizing that actually, obviously that's all around me. And I had ideas that theater looked like X, Y, and Z, in terms of entertainment and like large shows. And of course, in the real world, what it means to be a theater artist can be so dynamic and can have so many ways to interface with community work and with grassroots movements and with equity and that kind of activism. And I think sort of like asking those questions of, how can, theater better support this kind of movement building or, this kind of social change work has sort of been questions that I just sort of iterate and ask again throughout my career. And so it's looked like different things, but work that I've done in the city includes running an organization called the Amy Project for 5 years, the Artist Mentoring Youth Project, where you've been a mentor, which is awesome. That's an organization that supports young people from equity-seeking communities to get free training and creation opportunities. Amy works in partnership with lots of great big organizations like Canadian Stage and SummerWorks, and those partnerships it's a great way to introduce young people to the possibilities ahead of them. And I've done lots of kind of theater research around issues of cultural diversity and social engagement. I edited a theater journal called Alt Theater for 5 years. And I'm a director and a theater maker.
It's interesting to me to hear that accessibility of theater for you when you were a young person, it was your doorway to the form, and that you of course have gone on to create those kinds of platforms for so many youth, so many communities. But I have two questions.
Sure.
Going back to those initial community theater spaces when you were young, what were those? What kind of work were you doing? What was it that said to young Nikki, oh, you can just do this? You can just tell stories on stages? You can just make experiences on stages?
Totally. I mean, it was totally my inner monologue at 8 years old. Was like, you can just do this. And I had this concept of theater. I mean, I grew up in a family that loves the arts and, music and, like natural storytellers, but, theater as like this sort of specific form was not like part of our, family. Like we didn't go see plays or whatever, because, a lot of families don't, because like in terms of like professional theater in Canada, there's a gap. When I had an opportunity, just, in my school in Scarborough, there was like, they did a school play. It was like a whatever kids play. I was, in grade 3. And I just had this concept of what theater was, because I think I had seen the concept of theater like on television, like TV characters in school plays. And so I was like, this thing, I can do that. And yeah, so that's what it was. I was really, really attracted to the idea of storytelling and to this just the celebration and the ritual of it. And like, yeah, I've always loved being part of big collaborative things, and I think that was like the initial motivation. And then growing up doing, in Scarborough, and then like when my family moved to Durham in high school, doing community theater in Oshawa, again, like large plays, musicals, things like that. And then once I got to high school and I was starting to sort of take it a little bit more seriously, I had the opportunity to direct for the first time in high school when a teacher went on mat leave, and she was the one who always directed the one act dramas. And she said, "Do you want to direct the one act drama?" And that gave me a chance to, I remember like it was such a high stakes decision for me. And I spent like days and days and days in the library, like reading plays and researching plays and really wanting to find a play. I was like, this is my opportunity to tell a story that like could resonate. And I was like, I wanted to pick something that was maybe feminist, or that talked about racism, or that had a powerful story. I ended up landing on This Is For You, Anna, which is this Canadian play by, there's a collective of feminists, kind of Night Woody type people. Anyways, and like, it's often done in high schools, but like for me, it was like really exciting to be like, wow, I can actually bring a feminist story and, bring my classmates together. And I think that was like, that really was like a thing that showed me that I could use, directing and the opportunity to sort of decide what plays are being shared in a space to open conversations about social issues. So even as a teenager, that was my first sort of exercise in that, and kind of helped shape some of my thinking early on.
That's so exciting. I guess it's, theater, you don't have that initial barrier of access of I need to get cameras, I need lighting equipment. I mean,
Exactly.
obviously theater requires certain resources, but at a really fundamental base level, you just need people and some space.
Yeah, and
And
like, I mean, when you're a kid, there's not a big difference between doing something like that on your school stage and then doing it in your living room for your family, which like I'm sure you did, and I did. And you actually, theater does not require expensive resources. It can be enhanced or impacted by that, and of course those do make a difference, like at the professional level. But yeah, it's not a form that requires much more than a human body. And that's like, I think, the really exciting thing about it that makes it feel kind of like ancient and
mm,
powerful.
I'm glad you said the word ancient, because I know that that is something I've heard you say before, and something I've read about you is an interest in desire to connect to the ancient through this art form.
I think that there's so much value to be accessed through, if we allow our relationship to theater to be something that is what it has been, or in indigenous cultures around the world since time immemorial. And I mean, I think that is present in our contemporary theater going culture, and we can work to uncover it more, not in a way that's like stepping back, but that's like allowing us to sit with like the multitude of like thousands of years of knowledge around like what theater can be, and use that to inform like how we go forward. And yeah, again, a theater as like a site for conversation, as like a laboratory for conflict. I love to think of art as like an opportunity to be like a laboratory for conflict, where collaboration. And I think sometimes in Western culture, we're like afraid of conflict, we want to be polite, but actually creating opportunities to have to like say, this is my idea, this is your idea, like how do we work together to create something together, is the skill.
Mm-hmm.
It's the skill that gets us through. And I think like as creators, and also between artists and audience, to like allow that to be part of how we engage with the theater space and the performance space and audienceship is just like it like allows the theater to be like a gym where we become better humans and better citizens. um and I think like so much culture is produced and reiterated or named through what we put on professional stages, in terms of what is high culture, what is good writing. And so it's also an opportunity for us to really interrogate, where is that writing coming from, why do I think it's good, what else good is there that I just wasn't taught in school, but might have been taught in my great grandparents' schools, and to bring those onto stages as well. So I think it's an opportunity to really do that kind of digging and decide, really work at what we want to archive and to bring forward and celebrate.
This is such a good moment for that. We're in the great intermission, as
Yes.
I've heard it referred to. And, you know, when we come back, what do we want to highlight? What do we want to prioritize on our stages and our spaces? I even in my own language around theater making, you know, I just said to you, I use the word storytelling. You use the word storytelling. And then I
Mm.
even think that is sometimes such a Western definition of
Hmm.
theater, that it always requires story and can't be ritual or experience, uh, in the absence of story as well, and just a communal
That's a
event.
great point. That's a great point.
You have an MFA in community engaged theater.
Yeah.
Uh, so we can chart the course from, you know, you're in plays, and then you realize that you can do this, and then you want to do something important, so then you go forth and you train in theater, but theater that is really, well, what exactly is an MFA in community engaged theater?
Yeah. Before my undergrad, I did a like a Bachelor of Arts degree, which was, you know, again, I set out not to do theater, but then I got this like undergrad like theater scholarship from, and there was a stipulation that you have to study theater. So I tacked on a theater minor, but I was studying international development because I was like an idealistic teenager whose, you know, family came from, you know, a culturally vibrant, but like economically devastated, colonially devastated country in the Caribbean. And like was really interested in like being part of, you know, trying to make, you know, progressive, like positive change to places that were, you know, experiencing the ramifications of colonization. And the way that I did that was, you know, I got this degree in international development and this minor or a double major in theater or whatever. And I was thinking at the time that, you know, like that I wanted to use theater in a way that worked with like international development. But I kind of, after a couple of years of like poking around in that and working with a few NGOs, had some good experiences, but also saw I was kind of feeling the weight of the sort of difficulties, the ethical difficulties of doing that work, which can so often, you know, have good intentions, but really reproduce the same stuff that, you know, colonialism did with, in terms of, you know, even myself as a Canadian born, you know, settler person here, going even back to the place where my parents came from or other, you know, other places is weird dynamic. So I was just thinking more and more about like, what does it mean to actually apply some of those practices and intentions to actually the place where I live and I'm a settler and like where there's like lots to be done here, not to stop thinking globally, but to like, you know, live where I am. And I worked with a company for a bit in Victoria just while I was sort of bopping around living there in my early 20s called Puente Theater. And I worked with a director called Lena de Guevara, who was like a great mentor for the brief time I was there. And, you know, and like seeing her practice, which really like mixed what some people call applied theater and also theater making. And, you know, that, you know, that and working with a few other mentors too was what really sort of showed me kind of the ways in which that work could exist. And so I ended up finding this program at the University of Alberta, which is a giant theater department, which is, you know, useful. Um, and it was a fairly new program, but it allowed me to sort of mix theater directing training with thinking about facilitation and practices in applied theater and kind of work a bit in this interdisciplinary way within the theater department to start to hone my practice. And because I did that quite early in my career, like I was still in my like early mid 20s when I applied to that program. And, you know, actually it was super early. I was still like learning and, you know, still am, but still really learning who I was as an artist and a theater maker. But I think like the fact of doing a program like that allowed me to sort of articulate to myself who and what I wanted to be in my career. That's still shifting, but I think that it was formative, at least insofar as I had to stop and think about what does this sort of weird thing that I'm, you know, kind of self mapping out mean. Was that even an answer to your question?
Yeah. But I want to talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about community engaged theater,
Yeah.
community engaged practices. It's interesting. The Professional Alliance of Canadian Theaters and the Canadian Actors Equity
Mm.
have recently gone through like a long negotiation, as you know, to change and update to some degree the Canadian Theatre Agreement, which is the huge book of clauses and working conditions and rules about how packed theaters operate with
Yeah.
equity actors. And a huge part of that negotiation was the addition of a section on community engaged practices, because I think PACT was brought this to the table. And I think Pact and Equity were recognizing that this is a way increasingly that actors who might be equity actors want to also work, that artists want to work, that theaters want to work. So for our Tarragon audience who might be less familiar with the term community engaged practices, can you just talk a little bit about what that might be or look like?
I think, the term means a lot of things to lots of different people in different communities. And I think a definition that works for me includes making theater in a way that is in active artistic collaboration with people and communities who have an interest in the subject, the form, or the process of the work, who aren't necessarily professional artists. I sometimes feel like I have a hard time even with my own definition there, because what I love about community engaged theater is that it can really challenge a lot of binaries that are established in our particular Canadian theater culture around this is an artist, this is not an artist. And it helps, again, thinking about ancient ideas, return us to pre-colonial ideas of that art is part of society and part of interaction and a part of how we, express spirituality for some people, or express ritual. And so, it helps kind of put art back in the hands of people. That being said, I think skill is a real thing that you cultivate, and craft is a thing that you cultivate. And I think community engaged theater connects people who really prioritize their time in thinking about the craft of theater with others who want to step into a conversation. And so looks like lots of different things. Sometimes I think of our work that we did when I was at the Amy Project as a kind of community engaged theater, even though that's there's a lot of young people who participate in that program who go on to have careers in theater and that way aren't non-professional artists or just emerging artists. There's still an idea of, there's so much story making in that space that's around people's lived experiences and, connections across the groups around, identity and ideas about social change. And I think that also can characterize community engaged theater is when we see ourselves as a community, we want to talk about ourselves as a community, that content driven approach, not just who's in the room, but what we're doing. And honestly, I think it can be valuable to think of certain kinds of just professional artists getting together if they're organizing themselves or ourselves in a particular way. If a bunch of women who have had a shared experience around a kind of gender-based violence, who are all also professional actors and playwrights, create a play together about those experiences, it's I think it's useful to think about that as a kind of community engaged theater as well, because of where the source of gathering is and the subject of the work and how we bring ourselves into it, or that there's a collective expectation and permission to be a whole person in that process, as opposed to other processes where equally valuable, but you might have boundaries around not wanting to bring your whole self to the process and treat it as a practice of your craft and trade, and inhabit a character, and maybe there's more emotional distance from yourself as a person and your own lived experiences.
This is not a new idea, and we don't mean to imply that it is a new idea.
Yeah.
It's ancient, as you say, but also on Toronto stages, it does make me think of the Farm Show as a kind of community engaged practice. And then possibly now, if one were to do that project again, one might push to see a little bit more permeability between the performer and the community member that they're telling the story about, in terms of who's choosing the stories and who's on the stages and
Totally.
who's in control of the narrative.
And yeah, the authorial voice. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's not a new idea, and that's what's great about it. I do think it is newer for mainstream Canadian stages to use community engaged elements in particular ways. I think that is true, but it doesn't, that's new within a 60-year history, so it's not that new.
So you got this MFA in community engaged practices, and where did you head from Edmonton?
I stayed in Edmonton for a bit because I out of my MFA developed a little company, and we made some work together for a couple of years, which was awesome. Through that work, I was really thinking about creation practices that are rooted in thinking that is decolonial and feminist, and I found a great community of collaborators there. I taught at U of A briefly, and more or less from there, I came back to Toronto, where I've been I've been since. Community engaged arts is not like for me outside of everything I do artistically. It's really wrapped up in it. But also at the same time, in the past couple years, I sort of decided that I wanted to take a bit of a break from sort of the leadership I was doing in community engaged arts and focus more on just some projects because I had some bubbling up, and I kind of wanted a break from that kind of working in a way that was really, really focused on bringing together lots and lots of people and like, yeah, make some plays in a different kind of way with that was where I got to really get to be a bit more selfish about my craft and focus on storytelling in a different way, collaborate with some collaborators that are great. And so that's kind of like what I've been more up to in the past couple of years. It did overlap with the pandemic, surprisingly, which has been everything that it's been, but it one thing that it is a time where you're working with less people in person.
Can you tell us a bit more about those projects?
Sure. When I was in my master's degree, I think it was very early on in like 2012, I took a workshop with an artist named Diane Roberts, who has this great process called the Arrivals Legacy process, where you create a character based on a personal ancestor. It's like a big subject of her own work. And I went to do that process to get some methodology, or to learn about the methodology to apply it to the practical work I was doing in my MFA. So I did this like intensive process where I like explored my mother's mother's mother as a character, then kind of just like uncovered a bunch of stories, put them on a shelf, and then like did my MFA, really thinking about that experience in terms of methodology and like how it could benefit other people. And then 6 years later, I was like, I think I should write this play. So that's a big thing that I've been doing right now. I'm in Nightwood Theater's Right from the Hip playwrights unit with a great cohort of people, including people like a decade my junior who I mentored in the past. But it's so cool to, be able to like focus on things that I didn't focus on earlier in my career. Sometimes I feel like I did things out of order, but developing that play, again, using community engaged methods, I'm just like writing the play, but I'm also like interviewing elders, and I'll be hosting some workshops with other, queer Indo-Caribbeans, and, sort of charting out it's part of how I'm gathering information to feel empowered to write the play. And that's been a really exciting process. And I'm also developing a show with Nima Bickersteth and Movable Beast Collective. We're currently in residence at the Theater Center called Black Paris, which is wonderfully drawing from her lived experiences as a Black classical singer, and collaging that with stories from or text from Alice Walker's wonderful essay In Search of Our Mother's Garden. And that's a really great interdisciplinary project. We're also using community engaged workshops as part of our very sort of like slow cooking, long creative process. So those are, and then I'm actually continuing to do some like really community engaged work through a collective I work with called Confluence Arts Collective, where we work in relationship with people who are experiencing incarceration and experiencing criminalization, which has been difficult through the pandemic because we haven't been able to go into spaces that we always do, but through a combination of like working outdoor and distance and online, we've managed to continue this program, which actually I hear feedback from some of the community organizations we work with that it's the only program that's been running through this like network of agencies through the pandemic. Our small little program that we just sort of self-produced with like public arts funding. So it's been it's been really good to stay connected through that program as well.
I'm so glad you brought up Confluence Arts Collective, because I wanted to ask you more about that. First of all, thank you for the work you're doing. That sounds so meaningful during a time that's even more isolating than usual, I imagine. How did that collective come about, and how did you initially touch base with some of these agencies and in turn get access to this population?
So a colleague, a friend, Jackie Olmsted, she had the idea because she had sort of earlier in her career done like prison theater work with the support of some mentors, and was, we and some other people who had met in different contexts, she reached out to say, I want to like get back to this kind of work. Really interested in also an angle of it. Prison theater can be so often focused on kind of narratives of like rehabilitation, which some people believe in, but that, so we think sometimes like reinforces the idea that prisons can actually be a site of healing, where we think it's a bit more complicated than that, and that prisons are often sites of harm, and people who are criminalized are often victims of crime themselves. And so how thinking about how prison theater, I keep putting it in quotes because it's funny to think of it as a genre, but can be something a bit more liberatory. And as we sort of were organizing ourselves around that, initially we reached out to different people. I reached out to friends who I knew more through activist spaces and had sort of stronger connections to the prison industrial complex through lived experience of themselves or family members. We have like quite a variety of people involved in this collective who have, a really big range of lived experiences and cultural identities and social locations and artistic practices. It's very interdisciplinary. And I think that's like a really important part of the group. And, we really try to work collectively and to really be values led and not let the desire to make theater come first, but to like think about, is this reinforcing the status quo or is it not? And that's really driven a lot of our partnerships throughout the history of the group, which has been, we're going into our 4th year now. 2 members have actually gone on to full-time jobs with different, actually like, non-arts agencies working, one with like kind of a larger, more mainstream agency, and one with a smaller, more kind of grassroots abolitionist agency. And like, we also still have similar values, but that kind of having all those perspectives has really enriched the work and complicated it. And also that maybe answers your questions about like, how we like get access is, so we work inside an institution, but we also work with community outside who have previously experienced incarceration, which is more what we're doing in this current moment. But yeah, so those positions help us sort of like, maintain relationships.
And in terms of the work and the space that you're creating for people experiencing incarceration, what is this about? Like providing a platform for them to write or create or create community inside those institutions? Or
I think it can mean different things depending on the moment. I think for people who are, for example, inside institutions, like the lack of access to resources to just do art you might do otherwise is a big thing. So I think sometimes we just see ourselves as in a position to like curate and bring in materials and, provide like the support of professional artists, but really like to create experiences. For a while we were going in on Friday nights and Friday afternoon, Friday evenings, and it was really nice about like how can we make this like a joyful kind of like Friday evening experience. A big project we did in 2019 was in partnership with this production of Michel-Marc Bouchard's Lilies, which was at Buddy's and Bad Times Theater with Why Not and Lemon Tree Creations was their project. And so we had like a counterpart project running at Confluence the entire time, where folks there devised a show that was in kind of response to a lot of the themes of Lilies and in collaboration. And then that devised show was presented on the same stage in the Buddies main stage, which was really nice. And people from the Lilies process came to our Confluence process and vice versa. It was an attempt to really see how and Lilies is set in a prison, which is important, and it's also a very queer play. And this is like a mostly like working with lots of folks who are transgender and two-spirit and queer, to sort of really try to like build convergences between those projects was a way to help kind of like enrich both. And so that's an example of like what that looked like. It was a theater making process that also involved relationship building between artists who are exploring themes kind of metaphorically, but trying to actually anchor those in the lived experiences of people in our neighborhood in ways that kind of like also center the artistry and the humanity of people that were participants, and really trying to like resist ideas of like you're the artist, you're not the artist, but like we're all just entering this project from different points with different training, and like some expertise comes from artistic training and some expertise comes from lived experience, and there's other expertise as well.
Again, returning to those sort of foundations of community engaged theater making.
Absolutely.
You mentioned Why Not, who is a
Hmm.
co-producer on Lily's, and Half-Life is presented in collaboration with Why Not, really through your presence. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the This Gen fellowship that I know you recently completed with Why Not.
Yeah, happy to. This gen is it's really an outgrowth of a lot of different work that Why Not's been doing around, yeah, trying to strengthen certain areas of the theater sector. And so it's an artistic leadership fellowship for BIPOC folks who are non-binary and who are women. And I was part of the inaugural cohort, which was so exciting. So in the case of that cohort, people came in with, there was, I think, six or seven of us, and we had different areas of focus. And it allowed me, I mean, the timing of it started with the pandemic, but it still managed to be super fruitful, where I got to spend a lot of time with online mentorship with a director in London, UK, named Kirsty Housley, who is like an incredible uh, genius, like who does devise work that is so, where form and content are so tightly wound together, and she does like the weirdest, coolest things with design. I thought that was really exciting for me. An area that I wanted to really focus on in the fellowship was increasing my confidence and imagination around like weird big design elements. The thing about, as I'm sure you can relate to an extent, Courtney, is like growing up in indie theater or in like theater that doesn't necessarily have like high budgets, it can limit your, you know, the more money and resources you have access to as an artist of any kind, the more you have confidence doing certain kinds of work. And if you don't, or if you aren't afforded a lot of experience working in giant theaters, how are you supposed to know to work with giant design budgets and possibilities unless you know have those around you? So this was a goal. I was like, I want to like be less fearful about those kind of big ideas. And I think, you know, working with her really allowed me to do that. Even though there was no in-person, you know, theater creation, it was really awesome. And there's lots else about the fellowship that's great. And I got to be on the jury for it, for the second cohort. So I feel really, really excited about this massive group of like incredibly talented people, mostly focused this year on like cultural leadership and directing. So if you're interested in learning more about like a really cool current generation, not next generation, but, you know, this gen of artists, I would say check that out.
That's awesome. And yes, I totally relate to that, what the indie theater design budget thing. I have
Yeah.
so often, you know, when you're also kind of the producer, or certainly aware of what's going on in the production end of things, and you get an idea from a designer, and then you're like, no, but we can't afford it. You're already limiting your own
I
thinking.
know. Yeah. You're
Out
like,
of
but
a
we
sense of
just need like
responsibility.
40 holograms. Like, how can we?
Just
Yeah.
how can we make that happen? Cool. Let's talk a little bit about Half-Life.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful play. It's also such kind of, I think we're all thinking a lot right now about long-term care, about elder care, about the ways we've sort of abdicated responsibility, I think, in this province and this country with regards to elder
Mm-hmm.
care. And so it's really
Mm-hmm.
exciting that we're visiting this play that touches definitely on those issues. What was your first reaction in reading this script, knowing that you were going to direct this radio version?
I've been familiar with Half-Life since, you know, I was a student, and I think I directed a scene from it in a scene study once, or so. I knew the show. I remember, you know, I had um, actually originally how it came into the audio season is, I remember Richard had a different idea for a show, and and so we were talking about that as a possibility. You know, me, him, and then Robbie Jane from Why Not, we're talking about maybe other fits that could work better. And I think actually Robbie initially suggested it as we were going through things from the season that might be, you know, valuable to bring back. And so I immediately, like, as soon as he suggested it, I got really excited because I thought it would really resonate with this moment. Like, again, like at the time when it first came out, you know, I saw the original production when it was on tour to Montreal, and it was, you know, I think it brought like some things on stages that you don't often see, particularly this, you know, setting in an elder care home, and this kind of love story that's also a rumination on memory and on patterns and on what it is to be, what it is to have a mind. Immediately felt resonant with right now. And you know, thinking about how much the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted how we've dehumanized people who are in elder care homes, people who are, elder adults, and also just and people who experience memory loss. My grandmother has dementia. I feel like many people are connected to people who are, impacted by ageism and much older adults, and so I think that was like a really that felt like an opportunity to sort of, bring a show that is set in this context, and a show that's also so complex and really shows those characters with having like internal lives, and also the show showing, how much their those characters' agency is impacted or hindered by those who are supposed to caretake for them and do caretake for them and do love them, whether those are professional staff or adult children. But how quickly that caretaking can sort of be a kind of power that can help, it can hurt.
You also, in bringing this to the Tarragon Acoustic, you made some sort of original casting choices,
Mm-hmm.
which I think highlight the play in such an exciting way. Can you talk to us a bit about those choices?
Totally. In the original script, the main kind of love connection is between a woman named Clara and a man named Patrick. And so for this audio version, Patrick is being reimagined as a woman, as a queer woman named Pat. It's played by Alison Seeley Smith, and Clara is played by the Monique Mojica. Fantastic, fantastic actors. And yeah, and so the choice to have this relationship be a queer relationship, it really just felt super natural. Like so much in the script, like is about this connection that they maybe didn't have, they think they once had, and now at the sort of like end part of life reconnected around, I think really resonates with thinking about as like a sort of younger queer person, thinking about intergenerational queer stories and what queerness looked like in previous generations where maybe it wasn't less visible. It felt like it was just waiting to be like excavated from the story. John Mighton was like super into the idea. He was like, yeah, sounds, it's just another way to think about the same thing. And I think it really like also just leans into the excellent themes in the play around like the sort of intergenerational care and like how we see our elder parents and the stories we project on them and how we react when those are challenged. um, and it was a way for me, to personally more deeply connect with the play. And yeah, I think we had a really really great time recording it, and yeah, I hope audiences find new pathways into the play as well, because I think there's so much there in the original script and also in our reimagining that's very universal.
It's also, there's a new angle I'm only just thinking of now, that in seeing Patrick is now Patty.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
love that. In seeing Patty now as a woman of color, you're also sort of highlighting this hidden history of women involved in code breaking, women
Oh
involved
yeah,
in
that's like a
technology.
big part of it. I mean, I feel like that's just really sexy right now, is like,
Totally.
because it's true. I mean, I think like when casting Patrick as Pat and as a woman is absolutely not only about like queering the story, but it's about situating, these are the characters have relationships to like World War II, right? They're either vets or spouses of deceased vets, or and have Pat be this woman who was a code breaker, I think is like also like sheds light on like a whole side of that kind of history that is often erased as well, and also really exciting. I mean, I think there's like a when I early in this process I was thinking about this, like what is this like pop culture appetite for like women code breakers, and there's like a million answers, and like I have like a hard time articulating like why it's so appealing, but I mean, I think it is in the way that like, oh, truths that we always knew were true, that this isn't work that was only done by men. It's like validating to see them in front of you or hear them, and I think the whole kind of the intersection of math with the storytelling in the play is so vibrant, and so to have Pat as a character embody that and be a woman is kind of just makes it more vibrant.
Awesome, Nikki. This has been so wonderful to talk to you about this and get a little bit of background on you, the work you're doing, and then a bit of your thinking behind Half-Life, which I'm so excited to hear. Um, so yeah, thanks, Nikki, for being with
Thank
us.
you so much, Courtney. This was really nice. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the show.